I am not very interested in the legal question because I don't recognize the legitimacy of the bodies.
Even of the Geneva Conventions, that's like talk about law of nations. That's really deeply set. To be blunt here, it's deeply set in part because of the experiences of the Jewish people in the first half of the 20th century. So for pro-Israel advocates to say, that seems a pretty drastic move to make.
Like I said, I approve of everything that's in there as a wish list that I would have.
Right.
But which body would enforce it? The UN? I do not recognize their legitimacy.
Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Sohrab Ahmari, U.S. editor, and today I'm joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon, contributor to UnHerd, an incisive political analyst, and I should add, a dear friend. Today we're going to discuss the morality of Israel's war in Gaza, which has become increasingly contested worldwide. So Batya, it's fair to say that you and I share a lot of premises. We both started our journey on the political left and gradually shifted to the populist right. And at the same time, it's also fair to say that this is an issue in which you and I probably increasingly disagree. Just putting my own cards on the table, over the past 2 decades, or for as long as I can remember as a kind of mature political person, I've been a supporter of Israel, of its right to exist and defend itself, spoke up after October 7th in terms of its right to defend itself. But today, I feel like the country is on a disastrous course, strategically and morally speaking. And I know I'm not alone. Speaking of people on the right, do you hear the same thing? Do you see the same thing? And do you think people like me have a point? And why or why not?
So first of all, thank you for being such a stalwart defender of the Jewish people for so long, as you continue to be. You are one of the strongest voices on the right against anti-Semitism, unequivocally, and that means the world to me and to many other people. So you're the kind of person who has a lot of credibility entering this conversation. And I take seriously, from a moral point of view, your opinions on this, and I'm excited to get into it. That said, I do think that the demise of support for Israel on the right has been greatly overstated. You are seeing a kind of America First sensibility coming for Israel as well. And it took a beat. So the kind of thinking around Ukraine that I think you and I shared 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that said we can condemn Putin morally and still say, is it really America first, or is it really our job to police this, to support it, to perpetuate this war? That was not how people thought about Israel, I don't think, 3 years ago. Now, increasingly, it is how America First people think about Israel as well. And that's fine. You know, for young people who cannot afford to buy a home to say, I don't want to pay for Israel's military offense or defense, like that's a totally reasonable position. But I think that most of those people are still pretty pro-Israel. And I think the sort of rubber meets the road when you would ask somebody, you know, would you prefer that the Christian holy sites be under the stewardship of a Jewish state or an Islamist Muslim state? I mean, it's pretty obvious, like, people would rather that be a Jewish state. Charlie Kirk had this really fascinating, it was a focus group with young people from Turning Point USA, it was like between 20 and 40, just to talk about Israel and anti-Semitism. And what emerged was 75% of them said, I'm pro-Israel. But they were sick of the aid, reasonable position, and they had noticed a kind of woke language policing entering the lexicon in defense of Israel. And that was what was really driving them away, being accused of anti-Semitism or seeing other people be accused of anti-Semitism. And it put somebody like me in a really interesting position. I now will refrain from calling things anti-Semitic even when I think they are sometimes, because I just don't need that. You know what I mean? Like, make your argument. So basically, I think you're right that there's a little bit more criticism of Israel entering things, but I guess I would disagree that it's on the kind of moral front in terms of making moral judgments against how Israel specifically is prosecuting this war. And honestly, I don't know that you and I would have that much disagreement on that either. So tell me where you're coming from.
Well, look, I didn't want to get right away into the sort of polling questions, but there are polls. Pew did a poll looking at disfavorable views of Israel, and it found that the sharpest shift has been among young Republican men between the ages of 18 and 49, where in 2019, 35% disapproved. Last year, they were at 50% disapproval. And then you add that, because that's only one segment, then you add like the broader populace of young people generally, Democrats and independents, and the number kind of becomes, to the point where you might say that where the U.S. Congress or even the Trump administration is on this war in particular is kind of out of tune with the populace at large. Now, having said that, I didn't want to get into the polling stuff right away. Where I'm coming from in this is, in terms of like control over the holy sites, that's obviously in Jerusalem and elsewhere. That's not at stake. It's, I'll be completely honest, like I'm pretty tired of seeing pictures of kids with arms missing or legs missing. The numbers, UNICEF today just said 60,000 total, of which 18,000 of the dead are children. You can kind of, at some point, like argue about the kind of at the level of the margins between the Gaza Health Ministry and other kind of reputable mainstream agencies. They might have marginal differences, but at some point it shakes out. My first question is, there's the immediate rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where Trump keeps saying, I think there's real starvation. And the Israeli political class kind of goes in different directions on that. So I guess let me ask you, like, do you believe there's mass starvation in Gaza, or it's beginning to play out?
Just very briefly on the UNICEF numbers, they said 20,000 were children, but 18,000. Hamas does start recruiting at 14, but by the UNICEF numbers of 14 till 18, that's still considered children. To me, the moral question is always and has always been, what is the ratio of civilian to combatant? Mm-hmm. And in this type of war, this type of warfare, this type of urban guerrilla warfare, where Hamas celebrates every child that's killed, Israel has done a remarkable job. And I'm not saying I like you, I am getting very sick of seeing those photos. And I'm in a different place certainly now from where I was a year after October 7th, 6 months after October 7th. But I think, looking back on this from a dispassionate point of view, taking into consideration things like the ratio, things like the nature of the war, Israel has waged this war very imperfectly, but I don't think to the extent that it's accused of. The mistakes it made come from Netanyahu's own risk-averse nature, his refusal to take responsibility for anything, and then the domestic policy where he got in bed with these horrible far-right animals. That led to big mistakes, one of them being the decision, I believe at the end of May, to stop aid from going into Gaza. And what happened then was they actually did have stores of aid in Gaza that were supposed to be able to last them for 4 or 5 months. But what happened is people would storm the areas, and completely understandably trying to feed their families. As a result, you would have a situation where 4 Israeli soldiers would see thousands of people running towards them. They would fire live ammunition to disperse the crowds. Whoever got there was then able to sell that aid at exorbitant prices, again, understandably, and all of the taxes off of that would go straight to Hamas. So you have Israelis sitting there realizing like their taxpayer dollars is paying for this aid, and money from that is going right into the hands of the butchers who are still holding their family members hostage. So part of it is, I think, very understandable. I do think Israel is held to a very different standard than anybody else. But part of it is really, it was very poorly handled. There were moments where they would conquer an area of Gaza and then withdraw from it because, the Biden administration said, you better not occupy it. And Hamas would come right back. They'd have to go right back in and lose hundreds of Israeli soldiers in the process, in addition to the thousands of civilians who were killed. So they didn't They didn't wage this war perfectly by any means. Is there starvation in Gaza? Certainly there is hunger. And the lower down you go on the socioeconomic level, the hungrier people are, the more vulnerable you are as a person in that society, the hungrier you probably are. The question is, at what point does the moral responsibility for keeping alive their own enemies divert from Hamas to Israel? I mean, and that is, I think, a serious moral question. Anybody who says that's an easy question, I think, is not really thinking it through. It is a hard question.
Well, isn't it a legal question, though? Because under the Geneva Conventions, if you are an occupying power, you're obligated to ensure that the civilian population is able to eat. And in this case, you can say, I think reasonably, that Israel controls Gaza to a remarkable extent. And so let me say on the point of like the legal obligation, you recognize a legal obligation under the Geneva Convention, which were put in place in light of the Holocaust?
It's a very interesting question. Israel is not occupying Gaza, so I don't know that it would apply. But I also do think, to me, international law, and this is, I guess, my America First populism showing through, is because there's a law is it's a compact, right? I mean, it's the result, a civil right, is the result of a compact that's made between a populace, an electorate, and a government. I mean, it has to be enforced, right? The thing that makes it a right or a law is that there's enforcement. And there is no enforcement of international law. And I think that's a good thing. I don't want anybody, as an American, I'm zealous of my rights. I don't recognize any international body telling me as an American what laws I should follow. I think that at the end of the day, I remember Glenn Greenwald asking me this early in the war. He's saying, well, so you don't recognize the Geneva Convention? I mean, of course I recognize it as something I wish for vulnerable people to have access to. On the other hand, obviously, the Israelis who are held hostage by Hamas have not had, even, the Red Cross has not insisted once on seeing them, or they don't have access to. And obviously, we want to have a higher standard.
But Israel and Hamas aren't comparable. I mean, but we all condemn
no
Hamas.
Doubt,
we all
yes.
know it's a terrorist group.
But at the same time,
we hold up Israel as like a light among the nations and this kind of the most moral army. It's a little bit so it's pick one or the other. Like either it's like we're totally we don't recognize, Israelis don't recognize international law. We think it's a kind of fiction. Or we are actually a very moral army. But like the two, it's a sort of a having your cake and eat it too situation.
It's not, because one is the moral question and one is the legal question. So I am very obsessed with the moral question of what Israel owes the Palestinians.
Okay.
I am not very interested in the legal question because I don't recognize the legitimacy of the bodies.
Even of the Geneva Conventions, that's like the law, talk about law of nations, that's really deeply set. And it's deeply set, to be blunt here, it's deeply set in part because of the experiences of the Jewish people in the first half of the 20th century. So for pro-Israel advocates to say, it seems a pretty drastic move to make.
Like I said, I approve of everything that's in there as a wish list that I would have.
Right.
But which body would enforce it? The UN? I do not recognize their legitimacy. So I don't recognize the legitimacy of anybody to enforce it. I do think that's good stuff that's written there as an ideal. But I am much more interested in the moral question because I am the person who enforces the morality of the Jewish state.
Well, this question of Egypt opening up, I think it's fair to say that there is fear in the Arab states of even the most friendly Arab regimes when it comes to their relationships with Israel, that opening up will mean essentially an invitation to not those Palestinians never coming back to their homes, right? Like that if we open up, a sort of ethnic cleansing will happen. And the thing is that you have the policy of no food, which you acknowledge has been going on for several months. Now under enormous pressure, the prime minister said I listened to the version that he delivered to his own people that sounded like he was pretty reluctant to do it. And Ben-Gvir said it's a mistake to do it at all, which was an acknowledgement that it was Israel that was holding it up in the first place. So in other words, Ben-Gvir was saying, how dare Bibi open up avenues which suggests that it was Israel holding it up all along. Now that that's happened, that the kind of the siege combined with statements about voluntary emigration, which Israeli cabinet members say all the time,
And Trump.
and Trump, which is disgusting. I mean, it's just I find repulsive. It's one of Trump's worst moments in the second administration. But Ben Gvir says it, Smotrich says it, Bibi will send emissaries to discuss it. Now, the thing is, it's I was watching Danny Danon, whom I've met, and I think he's a very smart guy, and I respect him, was on Piers Morgan yesterday, and he said, well, it's just like someone moving from London to New York. Is it though? Like, if you're saying we're going to make conditions, like Israeli policy in open rhetoric is we're going to make conditions so miserable, and then at the same time, this talk of voluntary emigration, that sounds more like coercive immigration. It sounds like Milosevic level stuff. Do you agree?
If it was voluntary, would you still find, if it was truly voluntary, if there was a way to that you could be the person interviewing every Gazan, say, judging how much they truly wanted to emigrate, if you could be convinced that they truly wished to leave, would it still be repulsive to you?
I just think that's it's like saying, do you wish that there never were rain? I really hate, we're in New York right now, and it's this kind of muggy, rainy weather while we're recording. And I hate this kind of weather. And so in theory, if someone said, hey, here's a document that says if you sign it, there will never be this kind of muggy, rainy weather ever again. Sure, yeah. But I just don't, after you've had mass hunger or at least the threat of it, and all the other miseries afflicted on the Gazans, like, some share of them could be voluntary, I grant that, but not on the scale that the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir seem to want, right? Like, they want, like they keep saying, who was it, the Amichai Eliyahu, who said, we're driving toward wiping out Gaza. And then a member of the Knesset yesterday said, well, all these Europeans are recognizing a Palestinian state, but God willing, by September, when they get around to it, there won't be a Palestine to recognize. Like, I don't know. Like, I've always been pro-Israel, but it's like, sometimes it sounds, its leadership combined with its actions gives like Serbia circa 1998 vibes to me. Are you comfortable with all that?
I'm not comfortable with it. I'm not comfortable with the comparison either, because I think, the question that people need to, I would ask you, okay, which steps would you be comfortable with Israel taking to rid itself of the genocidal threat that lives next door to it, that is supported by much of the, I don't like any of that. I mean, the voluntary, I'm totally comfortable with if it is truly voluntary. And I do think a lot of people would leave. I disagree with you that the reason the Arab countries don't want to take them in is because, they're sort of pro-Palestinian. I think it's the opposite. I think Egypt has not allowed a single 90-year-old grandmother or infant to cross that border because they suspect they're all carrying water for Hamas. And nobody gives Egypt a hard time for having made that assessment. I mean, they face their own Muslim Brotherhood threat. I think that's probably true of a lot of moderate Arab countries who really, really have a racial disdain for Palestinians across the Arab world. So I think it's a little bit darker than you're painting it. And that's tragic. I mean, like a people who have been utterly, utterly abandoned by any person who even claims to care about them. But I would say to you, I would ask you, what is Israel allowed to do? What would you have them do to truly rid themselves of this threat?
Well, I mean, I listened to President Trump, who reportedly today said that again, it's background sources, but after a while, the background sources mount to such an extent that you think, well, it's reflecting Washington's perspective, which is that the military aims have been largely reached, and so all that remains is the question of hostages, which I care deeply about. Like, imagine being in that. Imagine, I put myself in the shoes of Israeli families who have hostages. I would lose my mind. However, the largest share of hostages have been released in negotiations at this point. Like, the kind of Rambo-style rescue operations have not yielded as many liberated hostages as talks with Hamas. And then you have a Hamas that's, again, like by the assessment of our own government, is largely defeated. No one imagines Hamas coming back to government in any way. And you have over there, you have a Palestinian Authority. I mean, it was worth listening to the interviews that like their ambassadors give. Piers had one yesterday. The PA ambassador to London, and he was saying like, "Hey, we're ready to govern. We're ready to make peace." And everyone, like everyone in the region wants this, right? Israel was on this other path of like Abraham Accords, but look, you might say that all the Arab regimes are cynical, and I will never compete with you in my estimation of their cynicism. I share that, but all regimes are ultimately at least somewhat democratic. I really believe that. Like even the worst regimes are kind of democratic, and like the Arab world cannot make that peace, that larger peace that would give Israelis that sense of inner peace, which I don't think is lacking. That do we really belong in this region?
That's such a deep point, by the way.
What?
That all regimes are inherently
not inherently, but at least a little bit.
Meaning that they are responsive to the street.
To some extent, which is why, again, there's a darker thought here, which is I think like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are not entirely alien representatives of their own society. Like they're not like they're certainly represent a real extreme, to be sure, but they represent part of Israeli opinion. And like
I think people, you can't really understand how alien the settler right is to like the mainstream Israeli society.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I mean,
it's really,
but somehow they run the system, it seems. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
No. Well, because of the parliamentary system and because Bibi was so committed to holding on to power, which honestly, having seen the success with Iran as an American citizen, I wake up now feeling safer. And so you can't take that away from Bibi. That was he who got that through. And are there other leaders who could have? It's very unclear. But those two, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, are only in the coalition because of Bibi's desire to keep ruling. And I think that it's very hard to make this point because the point you're making is the obvious one. You have people in the cabinet. They say vile things. Horrible things are happening, and the idea that those should not be read as like
thank you. That's all I'm
causal
saying.
It's like it sounds crazy to say to someone, right? Exactly.
That's what lots of pro-Israel advocates horrible things happen, and it's either no, it didn't happen. You cannot trust any. Not only you cannot trust your own eyes, but you also can't trust any mainstream sense-making institutions. Not the New York Times, which said, for example, that Israeli IDF leaders had leaked to the Times that they don't believe that Israel was stealing the aid on a systematic basis. No, you can't believe the Times. You can't believe 115 mainstream aid organizations that there's starvation. They're against Israel. You can't believe this former Green Beret with a Purple Heart who seems to have pretty credible testimony with footage, et cetera, that children are dying waiting for food. You can't believe your own eyes. And then at the same time, when you bring up the cases of these bits of rhetoric, it's like, well, no. You see, that's a tiny bit of, it doesn't represent mainstream opinion. And I'm just grateful that you're willing to connect the two. Right? It's hard.
Well, I know, but I actually don't think. I'm saying, I understand why people see that. That seems like an obvious connection. But at the same time, I don't think they're representative of the average Israeli. Hates Ben-Gvir, hates Smotrich, and hates the settler extremists. But they do believe that the vast majority of civilians in Gaza support October 7th and support Hamas to this day. That's a morally serious view, right? Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they're morally unserious. They're horrible.
Mm-hmm.
But the view that actually pertains in Israel, I think we act like that's an unthinkable evil to think that way about an entire population. But of course, most of the evidence suggests that they are right about that Hamas is inextricably underlying Gazan society, that UNRWA was deeply, deeply connected to Hamas, and that the majority of Palestinians don't judge October 7th as being beyond the pale. So what you're asking is for the Israelis not only to live next door to people whose society will be fundamentally unchanged from before this horrific cataclysm, but also to continue sustaining that exact scenario. Now, it could be that the situation in the Strip is so bad that that is the moral position, that even pro-Israel people like us can say, you know what, I just cannot see another child with an amputated leg. I cannot support it. But the Israeli position is not evil. It's not insane. There have been a confluence of factors that have led to this situation, and some of them are unforgivable, but much of them, if not most of them, are completely morally justified. And I think that's kind of what's missing from the position. Like, it's very easy to look at pictures of children suffering and say it has to stop right now. But to tell Israelis that they shouldn't have the sovereignty to say, no, it's our country, we were attacked, we have a military, we're not going back to living, at the mercy of the world, because we've been there and we've done that.
But so if the judgment of the U.S. security apparatus, insofar as that filters up to Trump, and if the judgment of lots of European partners and allies of Israel's as well, is that largely what can be done militarily is done, the question becomes, is it moral at all? And I really strongly disagree, I have to say, Batya. Then it does become what seems to be the goal, which is to batter the population to such an extent that some sort of emigration takes place, so that this kind of mass of people whose views, who knows what sometimes we're told that only a minority supports Hamas and Hamas has this population captive, and now you're saying no, they all do support Hamas. But either way, it seems to me what you would be driving at is Israel cannot live next to these 2 million people. Therefore, what? They should all die?
So
they should all be pushed out?
It's your view that at this point, because the military goals have been accomplished, what Israel is doing is basically just trying to force them to want to leave, basically.
Just an enormous affliction of misery. And then again, it's not just me saying that, it's members of the Israeli government saying that.
Right, but it's not like the upper echelons of the military, they still believe they have a military goal in mind. Now, whether it's achievable or not, I think it's unknowable, but they're getting at something.
Yeah.
Trump has made it clear he wants this to end very soon. That said, Vice President J.D. Vance, before he was vice president, I think it was March or May of 2024, he gave this great talk in which he said, what would a foreign policy for the middle class look like? And he said it's obvious that the moral intuitions of the American electorate should be the moral intuitions that guide our foreign policy. And I think that's it. You know what I mean? That is the whole game right there. That is what sovereignty means for the United States. It is our taxpayer dollars that are funding this war. And if the moral intuitions of the American people turn against it, that should be the thing that dictates it. Now, I happen to think people are fools who think that Trump does not have a very keen understanding of where his base is at, and not just his base, but the nation at large. I think that over the last, 6 weeks, we've seen again and again and again the kind of podcast commentariat of the right, breaking from Trump and claiming, there's this big rupture and he's misreading things. And then, of course, the polling will come out and show that the base is right where Trump is. This happened on Iran. This happened on Epstein. It's happening now, I think, on Israel. He just has a very intuitive genius for reading where the people are at, especially where his people are at. And I know
today he said to the Financial Times quoted him saying to a donor that my people are starting to hate Israel.
I did see that. One anonymous quote, he is not talking like a person who feels that his base is turning on Israel. He tweeted out, you want to end the crisis in Gaza, release the hostages. He's against recognizing a Palestinian state, even though this is now something that's very in vogue in Europe. So when I see him start to shift, I'll take it seriously. But I do think that the American people still, by and large, right now, and the way that you phrase those polls, the polls, Pew, Gallup, they'll ask, who do you sympathize more with, Israel or the Palestinians? Of course, it's a very difficult question to answer, like 2 years into a war where one side has so much more military might. Like, you could be a pro-Israel person and still say, but still I sympathize more with the Palestinians right now. Like, obviously they're in a more lamentable, pitiable position than the Israelis. So I think a lot of the polling is not, and I think when the war ends, the polling will shift again. People like us will shift again because we could have, momentary differences with the government, with the way that it's being waged. To me, the most important thing is that democratic question of like, what are the American people willing to spend their money on and what are they not willing to spend their money on? And that is a totally legitimate. I think, honestly, as Americans, we've gotten more out of the aid we've given to Israel than Israel has. Israel's paid a very steep price for it. But that said, every citizen in Israel, as Marjorie Taylor Greene recently pointed out, has healthcare, and not every citizen in America has healthcare. So why are we giving them so much money? It's a very legitimate question, especially
why
indeed,
why indeed, I agree. But look, I think I disagree that this is a sort of a Humpty Dumpty that can be put back together easily. I mean, I think that there are deeper shifts taking place. Again, if you look at it generationally. To be honest, I think, and I've said this before elsewhere, but I think the Israeli leadership recognizes that they were facing a generational vice grip. On the left, all the energy is with people like Zohran Mamdani and AOC and new mayoral candidate in Minnesota and the like, in Minneapolis. And on the right, that was the left. And on the right, you have, look, at least in the sort of Trumpian policy apparatus, as you know, like you have like the principles typically. But then if you go to that, in the Pentagon and the State Department, you go down to like the assistant secretary of this and that level, feelings are different. And not because, by the way, they're like ferociously anti-Israel, right? They're not like anti. But certainly they think, look, the challenges of the future for the United States, the opportunities of the future lie in East Asia. That's where the rivalry that really matters is. And there's this kind of relatively small power in a in the long-term unimportant region to the United States that keeps like dragging us into things and or besmirching the American image, because America is ultimately the kind of public diplomacy and actual diplomacy backstop where it's like, the United States can discipline its allies up to a point not to break with Israel. And so it's like, and at the United Nations, certainly at the Security Council, we constantly use our veto. But so there are all these things happening. And I think the Israeli leadership, I think their mentality is we got to get what we can get now before, like in a half a decade or a decade, a different kind of mentality reigns on the left and the right. And as someone who wants Israel to do well, I want Israel to prosper and be happy. I worry that mentality is wrong, because the Israeli one where it's like, well, let's drive into Syria, into Lebanon, because that has a dialectical effect where each kind of apparent, let's say, recklessness at the very least, or risk-taking by Israel, and when it imposes the human costs that go with that, each of those make the generational vice grip tighter in the future. I disagree with your characterization that once the war is over, first of all, that this can be put back together. The horror is really horrible. And you can say, well, there are other horrors in the world, but I'm not financing it with my taxes. And second, it's this, what's coming in 5-10 years. Yeah.
I mean, like what was done to the Druze in Syria. Didn't we just, shake hands with Jolani and send him over a bunch of money?
Look, I've been at some point I became convinced that, I used to be very in favor of, like when I was much younger, a decade ago, when the Syrian civil war was young, I was like, yes, young Syrian Democrats. But like, 3-4 years in, I was like, nope, it's going to be like Islamists and they're going to endanger minorities. But it is what it, like at the same time, we want a stable Arab state system in the Middle East. Like, they just kind of coalesced back together after this 2 decades of strain, beginning with the Iraq war, which shattered Iraq and empowered Iran, and then like the Arab Spring, somehow miraculously, the Arab state system coalesced back together. And even Syria, which was probably the worst case, was beginning to become a state. For us to be able to leave, we need to be able to stand up, like relatively central government. So as you know, that's one where the Trump administration, not off the record, but openly parted ways with Israel on those attacks. Like Tom Barrack, the U.S. envoy to Syria, said, like, what the hell? Like, we didn't.
But the Israelis had to go in. They have a blood pact with the Druze, with their own Druze citizens. There's 150,000 of them.
Yeah.
And they made that blood pact before the state of Israel existed. And the reason Israel bombed Syria was because their Druze citizens, they could see their family members, was like 100, miles away. They could see their villages being torched and people being murdered in horrific ways. And they took to the streets and said to Israel, you have to go save our people.
Yeah. A while ago, I would have cheered that unreservedly, that action. But as it is, it's like, my perception of Israel, Batya, has changed. Like, it's like,
you no longer feel that you
humanitarian
can extend
intervention by these guys, like they are so brutal.
You no longer feel that you can trust their motivations, that you can extend the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something's shattered. So that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm just one editor, pundit, whatever. But I do think that the ramifications are wider than that. I guess I hate to. I'm just like sort of like Israel on trial, and you're the advocate. I don't mean to be like
fine.
that, but
that's what I'm here for.
It's just that we're forgetting the other one, which is the other side of the Palestinian question, which is the West Bank.
Yeah, that's I've said from the beginning. I think much of what is done in Gaza, at the time I would have said all. Now I'll say most or much downgraded, is justified, and pretty much nothing that happens in the West Bank is. They do kill terrorists in the West Bank, and I'm very comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a two-tier justice system there. I mean, it's horrible. So even when, the Israeli defenses of, you'll see these sort of pogroms in Palestinian villages, and the Israelis will say, well, it's just interethnic violence. And okay, but interethnic violence, if you have a two-tier justice system, no, then it's something else. And it's horrible.
So is the I mean, I think it was a bad idea for Europeans to start recognizing a Palestinian state as punishment for Israel.
Right.
Right?
And
you agree with that, I imagine.
Reward for Hamas, I mean.
Like, if you believe in it in principle,
Right.
do it for principle. Like, and especially bad is, we will recognize a Palestinian state unless you stop doing what you're doing in Gaza. That seems really unprincipled. I think we can at least agree on that.
Totally.
But
totally.
I mean,
the
like,
thing is,
I get very uncomfortable. And again,
But see, you can still be forced to defend Israel when you think it's being unfairly attacked. And this is part of the problem, is like people like me who want to be able to defend a just war, then being faced with a government like the one that Israel is currently being run with that has no moral credibility. And so it is like a very challenging position to be in. I mean, I would never defend something I didn't think was defensible. But obviously, like you, I can get triggered in both directions because, of course, there is so much gross anti-Semitism in the conversation. There is so much gross, like you said, they don't even believe in the Palestinian state, but they're going to do it just because they feel powerless to Israel and they want to hurt them. Like, it's pathetic. Like, care about some humans for a change. It's so gross.
Well, no, I've gotten to a point where I actually think, as a matter of principle, that a Palestinian state should be supported and on the table in a definitive way. So in other words, I'm not saying I wish they hadn't done it, but rather just do it on principle rather than as a kind of bizarre conditional punishment for...
I think people don't realize, so just like you were saying, well, Egypt won't allow Gazans in because they don't want to upset Israel. Actually, no, Israel would love them to open the borders, but they won't do it because they don't want Palestinians. People really underestimate the opposition from Jordan that establishing a Palestinian state would create. It would totally destabilize Jordan. 60% of Jordanians are Palestinians. Like, why wouldn't they overthrow the Hashemites at that point? People radically underestimate...
Why would they overthrow the Hashemites? Because we support the Hashemites. We back them. Like, Israel backs them.
I'm saying, why wouldn't the Palestinian citizens or half citizens in Jordan then say, well, why shouldn't Jordan be a Palestinian state?
But you really think Jordan is the major obstacle to a Palestinian state today?
I think people underestimate how little appetite there is among the people who are supposedly in favor of this. You think that the Egyptians want a Palestinian state on their border? They don't. I don't think the Saudis want it. I don't think the Qataris want it. All of these players, like the Trump is actually, this is one of my biggest beefs with Israel, is that Trump is trying to reimagine what the Middle East looks like. Like, he has such a huge vision for it. The Israelis are fundamentally incapable of seeing that and taking advantage of that, of what he's offering them here, which is to settle this in favorable terms, but terms that will be acceptable to the other players as well. And I think just, what does Saudi want, right? Like, how do we, Trump wants...
I've listened, sorry to interrupt, I've listened to a lot of Saudi statements, and I think, look, they're not bleeding hearts, but I think because of their status in the Sunni Muslim world as the custodian of the two mosques and all of that, I think they sincerely keep saying, we're ready to recognize Israel, but not without taking the Palestinians into consideration in some way or other. Like, they're not, I think they're pretty sincere about that.
But they're not willing to actually be called upon to take any responsibility or any role. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
I mean, what can the Saudis ever do? It's just pouring money into everything. That's their one gift, is to like.
Why don't we start there? I mean,
sure, yeah, but look, I mean, so
an Arab League. I mean, like, obviously, the solution to this problem is not something that anybody has yet been willing to think big enough in order to tackle, and that's why I don't hold it against Trump when he says, like, Riviera on Gaza, whatever. He's thinking new thoughts. Like, it's, the solution that's going to come is obviously something none of us have. It's not an easy thing. It's not an obvious thing. It's something that's going to make a lot of people angry and going to take a big risk. And it's going to take real leadership on either side. And what makes a leader is someone who is willing to upset his own side and say, this is the right thing to do. And you'll agree with me in 10 years, the way that Trump did 10 years ago. And now everybody agrees with him.
But look, I've gotten to like the Peter Beinart point, and I used to argue with him so much, but like, it's like he's a one-stater and I'm not, but like, my support was Israel was always premised on the idea of at least like giving lip service to a Palestinian state. But early on in 2023, 2024, I began to hear from Israeli diplomats, including on the record from the Israeli ambassador to Britain, that like there's never going to be that's it. There's no state on the table. And then you're like, whoa, like you're going to rule over 5 million people in the West Bank permanently in this kind of state where you have absolute power of life and death over them. Just yesterday, a 31-year-old school teacher who'd been featured in that documentary, No Other Land, was shot by a settler who was a U.S.-sanctioned settler. And the IDF disrupted the mourning ceremonies for the killed that school teacher. Now, there was some confrontation. We'll see how the facts shake out. But that even if the most just trial is held for this accused person, which I question, of the killer, to do that forever, permanently, like then
no,
whoa.
It's unthinkable.
Right.
It's unthinkable. There has to be. Yeah.
There has to be a state. Yeah. There has to be something.
Well, something.
Well, no, but like, why don't they? I mean, why don't they have a sovereign right? Like, like the thing is, they have all the indicia of state of a nation state now. You could say like, yes, they were mere Jordanian Arabs, et cetera, but they now have a flag and a common sense of destiny. It's all the things that the kind of objective and subjective.
You either have to give them their own state, or you need to make them citizens of yours. Like, I'm comfortable with either of those. Like, they either.
Well, then
have
that's
to become,
the one-state solution.
Well, I mean.
That's like you and Max Blumenthal.
I'm a big skeptic of the demographic fears that some in Israel have. I don't think that they're real. And yeah, my preferred solution would be to give them all citizenship, and then you can just police them like normal citizens. But I'm not an Israeli.
And they would vote under this?
Yeah, of course. Why not?
Right,
yeah, well. Every human, as Hannah Arendt said, there's only one human right that's real. And it's the right to civil rights. It's the right to be a citizen. And they're stateless, and that's unacceptable.
Well, that's a really good place to stop. It's more agreement than I ever thought we would achieve by the end.
I'm very misunderstood, Sohrab.
I mean, we should have had Beinart here.
I know. Then you would have been the
a little bit
BB defender.
I don't know. Not anymore. Not anymore, Batya. But thank you. And thanks for engaging this conversation so thoughtfully and earnestly. And thanks to you for listening in. This was UnHerd.